Welcome to Verified Fears, where our horror family gathers to uncover the darkest truths that others are too afraid to tell. To all the new members joining us tonight and our loyal family who've been with us on this terrifying journey, we're about to dive into 11 disturbing stories that really happened on cruise ships. These accounts come from passengers and crew who experienced absolute nightmares while trapped at sea. We're talking human trafficking, medical cover-ups, and horrors the cruise industry never wants you to hear about. Each story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about those floating paradise vacations. My name is Leon, and I've worked maintenance on cruise ships for 8 years now. I thought I'd seen everything in that time: drunk passengers, medical emergencies, even the occasional death that gets quietly handled by the crew. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered during my night shift on the Caribbean Princess in March of 2019. It was around 3 in the morning when I got the call about a burst pipe in one of the restricted crew areas on Deck 2. These areas are off limits to passengers, tucked away behind unmarked doors that most people would never notice. The pipe was in a section I rarely worked in, down a narrow corridor that always felt colder than the rest of the ship. As I made my way through the maze of service hallways with my toolbox, I noticed how eerily quiet everything was. Even the usual hum of the ship's engines seemed muted down here. The burst pipe was behind a wall panel that I had to remove completely to access the plumbing. As I pulled away the metal sheeting, my flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. Behind the wall, there was a small room that wasn't on any of the ship's blueprints I'd ever seen. The space was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with makeshift bedding on the floor and what looked like food containers scattered around. But it was the scratches on the walls that really got to me. Deep gouges in the metal that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. And below them, words etched in multiple languages that I couldn't understand, but somehow knew were pleas for help. I should have left right then and reported it to security, but something compelled me to investigate further. Using my master key card, I accessed other maintenance areas nearby and discovered that this wasn't an isolated incident. There were 3 more hidden rooms, just like the first one, all bearing the same signs of recent habitation and desperate attempts to escape. In one of them, I found a passenger manifest page that had been torn from an official document, with several names highlighted in red ink. I recognized 2 of those names. They belonged to passengers who had supposedly fallen overboard during a storm we'd encountered 4 days earlier. The ship had conducted a thorough search, or so they claimed, but these people were never found. Now I was staring at evidence that suggested they might never have gone overboard at all. My hands were shaking as I took photos with my phone, trying to document everything I was seeing. The smell in these rooms was awful. A mixture of fear, sweat, and something else I couldn't identify but made my stomach turn. There were makeshift toilets fashioned from maintenance buckets, and in the corner of one room, I found a small notebook filled with what appeared to be a desperate log of days and times. The handwriting was shaky, frantic, and the entries spoke of people being moved from room to room, of injections that made them sick, and of others who were taken away and never came back. As I photographed the notebook, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. My heart hammered against my chest as I quickly stuffed the evidence into my toolbox and tried to look busy with the original pipe repair. 2 security officers appeared at the entrance to the maintenance area, their expressions cold and suspicious. They asked what I was doing there so late, and I explained about the burst pipe, showing them my work order. But their eyes kept darting to the wall panels I'd removed, and I could tell they knew something was off. One of them, a guy named Martinez, who I'd seen around but never really talked to, stepped closer and asked if I'd found anything unusual while doing my repairs. His tone was casual, but there was something threatening underneath it that made every instinct in my body scream danger. I lied and said no, just a standard pipe replacement. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. After they left, I worked as quickly as possible to fix the actual pipe and get out of there. But as I was gathering my tools, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The hidden rooms that I'd discovered were now completely sealed up again. The wall panels perfectly in place as if they'd never been removed. Someone had been watching me the entire time, and as soon as I'd left to get my repair supplies, they'd worked frantically to cover up the evidence. But I still had the photos on my phone, and I still had that notebook hidden in my toolbox. I made it back to my cabin without incident, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the corridor outside made me jump, and I kept expecting someone to bang on my door. The next morning, I tried to access the photos I'd taken, but they were gone, completely wiped from my phone's memory as if they'd never existed. Even the backup cloud storage had been somehow accessed and cleaned out. The notebook, however, was still in my toolbox, and I spent hours reading through it, piecing together a horrifying picture of what was happening on our ship. According to the entries, passengers were being selected based on specific criteria. Those traveling alone, those who had paid in cash, those whose disappearance wouldn't immediately trigger an international investigation. They were being sedated during routine medical visits or through their food and drinks, then moved to these hidden areas while the ship was at sea. The notebook described a network of crew members involved in the operation, from medical staff who administered the sedatives to security officers who helped transport the victims. But the most terrifying part was what happened to these people afterward. Some entries suggested they were being sold to buyers who met the ship at certain ports, while others indicated that passengers who became too sick or troublesome were simply disposed of overboard during night shifts. The notebook's final entries were barely legible, written by someone who clearly knew they were running out of time. And they mentioned other ships in the cruise line's fleet where similar operations were taking place. I knew I had to get this information to the authorities. But I also knew that if the wrong people on the ship found out what I'd discovered, I'd end up as another accidental overboard casualty. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings, and what I noticed made my paranoia seem completely justified. Certain crew members would stop their conversations when I walked by, and I caught security officers following me on several occasions. The medical staff began showing unusual interest in my health, offering unsolicited checkups and asking if I needed any medication for seasickness or anxiety. I declined everything and started eating only prepackaged food that I could verify hadn't been tampered with. The ship's internet connection, which was already spotty, became completely unusable whenever I tried to access outside communication or upload anything to external servers. It was clear that my electronic communications were being monitored and blocked. 3 days before we were scheduled to return to port, I overheard a conversation between Martinez and another security officer that confirmed my worst fears. They were discussing how to handle a maintenance problem that needed to be resolved before docking, and from their tone and the way they glanced around, I knew they were talking about me. That night, I made the decision to hide the notebook in a place where it might eventually be found by someone who could do something about it. I sealed it in a waterproof bag and hid it in an air duct in the passenger laundry facility, somewhere that would be accessed during routine maintenance, but not by the crew members who were involved in the conspiracy. I also wrote out everything I could remember on small pieces of paper that I hid throughout my personal belongings, hoping that if something happened to me, investigators might find enough evidence to piece together the truth. The final night of the cruise was the longest of my life. I barricaded my cabin door and stayed awake, listening to every footstep in the corridor outside. Around 4 in the morning, I heard someone trying to use a key card on my door, followed by quiet voices discussing alternate plans. I remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, until I heard them move away. When we finally docked the next morning, I was among the first crew members off the ship, and I immediately went to the police. But when I tried to tell them what I discovered, they informed me that there had been no missing passenger reports filed for our cruise, and that all safety protocols had been properly followed according to the ship's official logs. The investigation I requested was handled internally by the cruise line security department, and I was told that no evidence of wrongdoing had been found. Within a week of filing my report, I received a job termination notice citing performance issues and violation of company policies. My employment record was flagged in the maritime industry database, making it impossible for me to get work on any other cruise line or commercial vessel. I tried reaching out to journalists and maritime safety organizations, but without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, my story was dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled employee. The cruise line's legal team even sent me a cease and desist order, threatening lawsuits if I continued spreading what they called defamatory lies about their operations. I was effectively silenced, but I never stopped thinking about those names in that notebook. Those desperate scratches on the walls and the people who disappeared into those hidden rooms. Sometimes I wonder if that notebook is still there, waiting in that air duct for someone else to find it. And sometimes, when I see cruise ship advertisements on television, I think about all the passengers boarding those floating prisons, completely unaware of the horrors that might be waiting for them in the darkness below deck. If you've made it this far in this story, please remember to subscribe to Verified Fears for more terrifying true accounts that will keep you awake at night. And if you have your own horror story to share, you know where to find us. My name is Daphne, and at 67 years old, I thought I'd seen everything the medical world had to offer during my 42 years as a registered nurse. I'd worked emergency rooms, intensive care units, and hospice care. So when I decided to treat myself to a solo Mediterranean cruise in October 2021, the last thing I expected was to witness medical horrors that would make my worst hospital experiences seem like pleasant memories. The Norwegian epic was supposed to be my reward for surviving a difficult divorce and finally retiring. But instead, it became the setting for the most terrifying week of my life. It started on the third day of the cruise when I began experiencing chest pains during dinner. As a cardiac nurse, I knew the signs of a heart attack, and I was smart enough not to ignore them, even though part of me wanted to avoid ruining my vacation. The ship's medical bay was located on Deck 3, accessible through a discreet entrance that most passengers probably never noticed. When I arrived, I was impressed by how modern and well-equipped the facility appeared from the reception area, with gleaming medical equipment visible through glass doors and professional-looking staff in crisp white uniforms. The initial examination was conducted by a young physician's assistant named Rebecca, who seemed competent enough as she took my vitals and asked about my symptoms. However, when Dr. Martinez arrived to oversee my care, I immediately noticed something was off about his demeanor. His breath smelled strongly of alcohol, and his hands trembled slightly as he reviewed my EKG results. At first, I attributed his condition to fatigue or seasickness. But as he began explaining my treatment plan, it became clear that he was significantly intoxicated. His speech was slurred, he couldn't maintain eye contact, and when he attempted to insert an IV line, it took him 4 tries to find a vein that any first-year nursing student should have hit on the first attempt. When I questioned his condition and asked to speak with another doctor, he became defensive and assured me that he was perfectly capable of providing my care. The nursing staff seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but none of them spoke up or offered to intervene on my behalf. What happened next still gives me nightmares. Dr. Martinez administered what he claimed was a mild sedative to help with my anxiety. But within minutes, I felt more disoriented than I should have from any standard anti-anxiety medication. My vision became blurry, my hearing seemed muffled, and I had difficulty forming coherent thoughts. Despite my impaired state, I remained conscious enough to observe what was happening around me. And what I witnessed was absolutely horrifying. Through the partially open door of my treatment room, I could see into the main medical bay, where Dr. Martinez was now working on another patient, an elderly man who appeared to be unconscious. The doctor was performing what looked like a minor surgical procedure, but his movements were erratic and unsteady. And I watched in horror as he dropped instruments on the floor and then used them again without any attempt at sterilization. As the hours passed and the medication gradually wore off, I became increasingly aware of conversations taking place among the medical staff that suggested this was not an isolated incident. I heard Rebecca discussing with another nurse about how they needed to be more careful about disposal timing, and how the next port would provide them with an opportunity to handle the backlog. At first, I thought they might be talking about medical waste. But their tone and the specific words they used made it clear they were discussing something far more sinister. Through my partially closed eyelids, I watched as they wheeled a covered gurney past my room, and I could see a human form underneath the sheet. What disturbed me most was that they were moving the body during the middle of the night, and there had been no announcement about a passenger death, which is standard protocol on cruise ships. The body was taken to what appeared to be a storage area rather than the ship's morgue, and I heard them discussing how they would need to process it before morning. My nursing experience had taught me to pay attention to medical procedures and protocols, so I began mentally cataloging every violation I witnessed. Dr. Martinez continued to work while clearly under the influence, performing procedures with contaminated instruments and making decisions that no sober physician would make. I saw him administer medications without checking dosages, ignore obvious signs of patient distress, and at one point, I watched him nearly cause a patient to stop breathing by giving what appeared to be an overdose of sedation medication. The nursing staff seemed to be complicit in covering up his mistakes, falsifying medical records, and coaching patients who regained consciousness about what they should say if anyone asked about their treatment. I realized that I was witnessing a systematic cover-up of medical malpractice that was putting passengers' lives at risk, and possibly worse. The most terrifying moment came around 4 a.m. when I overheard Dr. Martinez and Rebecca discussing my case specifically. They were debating whether I had seen too much and whether I would be likely to report what I had witnessed once I returned home. Dr. Martinez suggested that they could easily justify giving me additional medication that would solve the problem permanently, and Rebecca agreed that it would be safer than risking exposure of their operation. They discussed how they had handled similar situations in the past, mentioning several passengers who had died of apparent heart attacks or strokes while in the medical bay, deaths that had been attributed to their pre-existing conditions rather than any medical negligence. I realized with growing horror that they were planning to kill me to prevent me from reporting what I had seen, and that they had likely killed other passengers who had discovered their operation. Fighting through the remaining effects of the drugs in my system, I forced myself to appear unconscious while carefully listening to their plans. They decided to wait until the morning shift changed to administer what they called the final treatment, which would give them time to prepare the necessary documentation to make my death appear natural. I heard them discussing how they would report that I had suffered a massive heart attack despite their best efforts to save me, and how my advanced age and medical history would make their story completely believable to any investigators. They talked about other passengers they had eliminated using similar methods, describing their deaths with a casual indifference that made my blood run cold. I learned that this operation had been going on for years across multiple ships in the cruise line's fleet, and that Dr. Martinez was just one of several physicians involved in what amounted to a systematic murder scheme disguised as medical care. As dawn approached, I knew I had to escape from the medical bay before they returned to finish what they had started. Using every ounce of strength I could muster, I quietly disconnected my monitoring equipment and made my way to the door. The facility was staffed by a skeleton crew during the early morning hours, and I managed to slip out unnoticed. But I knew that once they discovered my absence, they would come looking for me, and I would have nowhere to hide on a ship in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. I made my way back to my cabin, but I didn't dare stay there long. Instead, I spent the remaining days of the cruise hiding in public areas, staying close to other passengers and avoiding any situation where I might be alone. I documented everything I could remember about what I had witnessed, writing detailed notes about the medical procedures I had observed, the conversations I had overheard, and the evidence of the cover-up operation. When we finally reached port in Barcelona, I was among the first passengers off the ship, and I immediately contacted local authorities. However, reporting the incident proved to be more complicated than I had anticipated. The Spanish police referred me to maritime authorities, who told me that incidents occurring in international waters fell under different jurisdictions depending on the ship's flag country and the nationality of the passengers involved. I was passed between different agencies and departments, each one claiming that another authority was responsible for investigating my claims. Meanwhile, the cruise line's legal team contacted me with offers to settle any potential medical malpractice claims, clearly hoping to buy my silence before I could pursue formal charges. They presented me with documents claiming that Dr. Martinez had been found to have a medical emergency during my cruise and had been replaced, suggesting that any irregularities in my care were due to his temporary incapacitation rather than systematic negligence. Despite the bureaucratic obstacles and legal pressure, I continued to push for an investigation into what I had witnessed. I contacted medical licensing boards, maritime safety organizations, and even tried reaching out to journalists who specialized in cruise industry investigations. However, without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, my testimony was treated as the potentially confused recollections of an elderly patient who had been under the influence of medication during a medical emergency. The cruise line provided their own medical records showing that I had received standard care for a minor heart episode and had been discharged in stable condition. Dr. Martinez had mysteriously disappeared from their employment records, with the company claiming that he had never actually worked for them and that I must have been confused about his identity due to the stress of my medical situation. The most disturbing part of this entire experience was not just what I witnessed in that medical bay, but the realization of how easy it would be for cruise lines to cover up medical murders and make them appear to be natural deaths. Passengers who die on cruise ships are often elderly or have pre-existing medical conditions, making it simple to attribute their deaths to natural causes. The ships operate in international waters where investigation protocols are complicated and jurisdiction is unclear. Medical staff have access to drugs that can cause heart attacks or strokes, and they control the documentation of what treatments were provided. Families of deceased passengers are often more focused on their grief than on questioning medical procedures, especially when the deaths occur far from home and the bodies are handled by unfamiliar foreign authorities. I realized that I had stumbled upon what could be a perfect murder scheme, one that might have been claiming victims for years without anyone ever realizing what was happening. The thought that Dr. Martinez and others like him might still be out there, working on cruise ships and selecting vulnerable passengers for elimination, keeps me awake at night and has made it impossible for me to ever feel safe traveling again. My name is Dean, and as a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, I've spent my career studying storms and weather patterns across the Atlantic. When my wife Sarah and I decided to take a celebrity cruise for our honeymoon in September 2018, I thought my professional knowledge would just help us appreciate the ocean conditions and maybe impress Sarah with some weather trivia. I never imagined that my expertise would uncover a cover-up so massive and disturbing that it would change everything I thought I knew about maritime safety and corporate accountability. The Celebrity Eclipse was supposed to be a 10-day voyage through the North Atlantic, following a route that would take us from New York to Iceland, with stops in Nova Scotia and Greenland. From the moment we boarded, I was fascinated by the ship's weather monitoring equipment and the way the crew tracked atmospheric conditions for both safety and passenger comfort. Everything seemed normal for the first 4 days of our cruise. The weather was typical for the season, with moderate seas and partially cloudy skies that created beautiful sunsets. I spent hours on deck with my portable weather instruments, comparing my readings to the ship's official reports and finding them consistently accurate. Sarah teased me about bringing work equipment on our honeymoon, but she knew how much I loved weather observation, and she enjoyed learning about the meteorological phenomena we encountered. On the 5th night, however, something happened that would transform our romantic getaway into a nightmare that still haunts both of us. We were somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, about 600 miles from the nearest land, when I was awakened around 2 in the morning by what felt like a massive impact that shook the entire ship. The collision was so violent that it threw me from our bed and sent everything in our cabin crashing to the floor. The official announcement came about 30 minutes later, delivered over the intercom by the captain in a calm, measured tone that seemed almost rehearsed. He explained that we had encountered an unexpected severe storm that had caused some damage to the ship's exterior, but that all passengers were safe and there was no immediate danger. He asked everyone to remain in their cabins while the crew assessed the situation and made necessary repairs. As a meteorologist, I immediately knew something was wrong with this explanation. I had been monitoring weather conditions constantly throughout our voyage, and there was no storm system anywhere near our location. The seas had been relatively calm, with winds averaging only 15 to 20 knots and no significant precipitation. The atmospheric pressure readings I had taken just hours before the incident showed no indication of an approaching storm system, and the satellite data I could access through the ship's internet connection confirmed that we were in an area of stable weather. Despite the captain's instructions to remain in our cabins, I convinced Sarah to come with me to one of the upper decks so I could take direct weather measurements and see if I could determine what had actually caused the damage to the ship. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The night was clear with excellent visibility, light winds and calm seas that were completely inconsistent with the storm story we had been told. More disturbing was the damage I could see along the ship's starboard side, which looked nothing like storm damage. The metal was twisted and punctured in ways that suggested we had collided with something large and solid, not been battered by waves and wind. There were scrape marks along the hull that appeared to have been made by another vessel, and I could see debris caught in some of the damaged areas that looked like pieces of fiberglass and metal rather than natural storm debris. I began documenting everything I could see, taking photographs and detailed notes about the weather conditions, the nature of the damage, and the inconsistencies between the official story and the physical evidence. Sarah helped me collect some of the debris that had washed onto the lower decks, and we found fragments that were clearly from another vessel, including pieces with paint and markings that didn't match anything on our ship. One piece appeared to be part of a life preserver, with partial lettering that we couldn't fully make out in the darkness. As we worked to gather evidence, we noticed increased security activity throughout the ship, with crew members conducting what appeared to be systematic searches of certain areas and removing items that they placed in sealed containers. The crew's behavior was secretive and urgent in a way that suggested they were engaged in some kind of cleanup operation rather than routine storm damage assessment. The next morning brought more disturbing revelations. The captain's daily briefing included updated information about the storm damage, but his description of the weather conditions during the incident contradicted everything I knew about meteorology and everything I had observed directly. He claimed that we had been hit by a sudden squall, with winds exceeding 70 knots and waves over 30 feet high, conditions that would have been impossible to develop in the atmospheric environment I had been monitoring. When I tried to access weather data from external sources to verify the official story, I found that my internet access had been restricted and I could no longer connect to the meteorological databases I normally used for my work. The ship's public weather information system had also been updated to show historical data that supported the storm narrative. But the readings were completely fabricated and inconsistent with basic meteorological principles. During breakfast, I overheard conversations among the crew that made it clear they were all following a scripted story about the previous night's events. When I tried to engage some of the officers in technical discussions about the storm conditions, their answers were vague and contradictory, and it became obvious that they had been coached to provide specific responses to passenger inquiries. One junior officer accidentally referred to the incident as a collision before quickly correcting himself and returning to the storm narrative. The ship's daily newsletter included a detailed account of the storm that was filled with meteorological impossibilities, describing wind patterns and pressure systems that could not have occurred simultaneously in the same location. It was clear that someone had written the storm story without any real understanding of weather science. Assuming that passengers wouldn't have the knowledge to recognize the fabrications, as the day progressed, Sarah and I noticed that other passengers were beginning to ask questions about the inconsistencies in the official story. Several people commented that they hadn't experienced the kind of motion that would be expected during a severe storm, and others mentioned that they had seen lights from what appeared to be another vessel just before the impact. However, whenever groups of passengers began discussing their observations, crew members would quickly intervene to redirect conversations or separate the groups. We watched as passengers who asked too many questions were approached by security officers and taken aside for private conversations, after which they seemed reluctant to continue discussing the incident. The atmosphere on the ship became increasingly tense as more people realized that something wasn't right about the official explanation. That afternoon, I made a discovery that confirmed my worst suspicions about what had really happened. While exploring areas of the ship that were supposed to be off-limits to passengers, I found a storage area where crew members had collected debris from the collision. Among the items stored there were pieces of another vessel that were much larger than the fragments Sarah and I had found on deck. I could see parts of a hull with registration numbers that I was able to photograph, as well as personal items that had clearly belonged to people on the other vessel, including life jackets, pieces of furniture, and even what appeared to be luggage. The amount of debris suggested that the other vessel had been severely damaged or possibly destroyed in the collision, and the presence of personal items indicated that there had been people aboard when the accident occurred. The most horrifying discovery came when I found a section of the storage area that contained what appeared to be human remains. I'm not a medical expert, but I had seen enough accident scenes during my years working with emergency responders to recognize body parts when I saw them. The remains were wrapped in plastic and stored in a refrigerated container, clearly being preserved as evidence or for disposal rather than being treated with the respect due to accident victims. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Not only had our ship collided with another vessel, but people had died in the collision. And the cruise line was covering up their deaths rather than reporting the incident to authorities. I realized that we weren't just dealing with a simple accident cover-up, but potentially with multiple homicides and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the ship's command structure. I knew that I had to document everything I had found. But I also realized that Sarah and I were now in serious danger. If the crew was willing to cover up a collision that had killed people, they would certainly be willing to silence passengers who had discovered evidence of their crimes. I used my phone to photograph everything I could, storing the images in multiple cloud storage accounts and sending copies to trusted colleagues back home with instructions to contact authorities if anything happened to us. Sarah and I developed a system of staying in public areas during the day and never being alone in our cabin, always making sure that other passengers could see us and account for our whereabouts. We also began leaving detailed notes about our discoveries in various locations throughout the ship, hoping that if we disappeared, someone else might find the evidence and continue the investigation. The crew's behavior toward us changed dramatically over the next few days, as it became clear that they suspected we knew more than we were supposed to. Security officers began following us openly, no longer making any attempt to be discreet about their surveillance. Our cabin was searched multiple times while we were away, with items moved and personal belongings obviously examined. The ship's communication systems became completely unavailable to us, with our internet access blocked and our cell phones unable to connect to satellite networks even when we should have been in range. We were effectively cut off from the outside world and trapped on a ship with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. The final days of our cruise were a nightmare of paranoia and fear as we waited to reach port while trying to stay alive and protect the evidence we had gathered. We witnessed crew members dumping containers overboard during the night watches, and we could only assume they were disposing of more evidence from the collision. Several passengers who had been asking questions about the incident suddenly became ill with what was described as food poisoning. But their symptoms seemed more consistent with drugging than with any natural illness. Sarah and I ate only prepackaged food and drank only sealed beverages, and we took turns sleeping, so that one of us was always awake and alert. When we finally reached port in Reykjavik, we were among the first passengers off the ship, and we immediately went to local authorities with our evidence. The investigation that followed was frustratingly slow and bureaucratic, complicated by jurisdictional issues and the cruise line's team of lawyers who worked to discredit our testimony and suppress our evidence. The debris we had collected mysteriously disappeared from our luggage during the customs process, and the photographs I had taken were dismissed as being potentially manipulated or misinterpreted. The cruise line produced their own investigation report that supported the storm damage story, complete with fabricated weather data and witness statements from crew members. However, our persistence eventually led to an international maritime investigation that uncovered evidence of the collision and the cover-up, though the full extent of the crimes was never fully revealed to the public. The other vessel was eventually identified as a small research ship that had been reported missing around the time of our cruise, with all hands presumed lost at sea. The families of those victims never received the truth about what happened to their loved ones, and the cruise line faced only minor penalties that amounted to little more than the cost of doing business. Sarah and I were left with the knowledge that we had witnessed a mass murder disguised as an accident, and that the people responsible for those deaths were still free to operate their floating death traps in international waters where accountability is virtually non-existent. My name is Ada, and I'm a 45-year-old single mother who thought I was giving my 8-year-old daughter Emma and 6-year-old son Tyler the vacation of their dreams when I booked us on a Disney cruise to the Bahamas in February 2020. As a working mom who rarely had the time or money for elaborate vacations, I had saved for 2 years to afford this trip. Convinced that the Disney brand meant safety, quality, and magical memories that would last a lifetime. I trusted Disney's reputation completely, believing that their cruise line would maintain the same high standards of child safety and family entertainment that their theme parks were known for. What I discovered during that 7-day voyage was so horrifying and disturbing that it shattered not only my faith in corporate America, but my ability to trust anyone with my children's safety ever again. The nightmare began on our 2nd day at sea when Emma, who had been excited about participating in the Oceaneer Club Kids program, suddenly became withdrawn and refused to return to the children's activities. Emma had always been an outgoing, social child who loved making new friends and trying new activities, so her sudden change in behavior immediately raised red flags for me. When I asked her what was wrong, she became evasive and would only say that she didn't like one of the counselors and didn't want to go back to the kids' club. At first, I thought she might just be homesick or overwhelmed by the new environment, but her behavior continued to deteriorate throughout the day. She became clingy and anxious, refusing to let me out of her sight and waking up multiple times during the night with what appeared to be nightmares. Tyler, who was younger and had been participating in a different age group within the same program, didn't show the same level of distress, but I noticed that he too seemed less enthusiastic about the children's activities than he had been initially. When I tried to encourage both kids to give the program another chance, Emma became hysterical and begged me not to make her go back. The next morning, I decided to observe the children's program more closely before making any decisions about continued participation. I positioned myself where I could see into the Oceaneer Club through the large windows that separated the children's area from the main corridor. And what I witnessed made my stomach turn. One of the male counselors, a young man in his early 20s who introduced himself as Jake, was paying inappropriate attention to several of the younger girls in the program. He would find excuses to touch them unnecessarily, putting his hands on their shoulders, backs, and legs in ways that made me uncomfortable even from a distance. More disturbing was the way he would isolate individual children from the group, taking them to corners of the room or into smaller adjoining spaces where other staff members couldn't see what was happening. I watched as he spent an unusual amount of time helping Emma's friend Sophia with an art project, positioning himself behind her and reaching around her in a way that was clearly inappropriate for any adult working with children. I immediately went to the guest services desk to report my concerns, but the response I received was dismissive and defensive. The supervisor I spoke with assured me that all Disney cruise staff underwent extensive background checks and training, and that my concerns were likely based on misunderstandings of normal counselor-child interactions. She suggested that I was probably overreacting due to the stress of traveling alone with 2 young children, and she offered to have the youth activities manager speak with me to address my concerns. When the youth activities manager, a woman named Patricia, met with me later that day, she was equally dismissive of my observations. She explained that Jake was one of their most experienced and trusted counselors, and that he had worked for Disney for several years without any complaints. She suggested that Emma's reluctance to participate might be due to separation anxiety rather than any problem with the staff, and she offered to have Emma participate in activities only when other counselors were present, if that would make me more comfortable. Despite these assurances, I decided to conduct my own investigation into what was happening in the children's program. Over the next 2 days, I made excuses to visit the Oceaneer Club at various times, observing the staff interactions and trying to identify any patterns of inappropriate behavior. What I discovered was far worse than I had initially suspected. Jake wasn't working alone. There were at least 2 other male staff members who seemed to be part of a coordinated effort to identify and isolate vulnerable children. I watched as they would take photos and videos of the children during activities. But the camera angles and focus seemed designed to capture inappropriate images rather than document normal program activities. They would position children in specific ways for these photos, adjusting their clothing and poses in ways that seemed calculated to create compromising images. The female staff members either didn't notice what was happening or were deliberately ignoring it. And I began to suspect that the entire children's program was being used as a front for predatory behavior. The most damning evidence came when I managed to overhear a conversation between Jake and another counselor named Marcus, during a brief moment when they thought they were alone in the hallway outside the children's area. They were discussing specific children by name, making comments about their physical appearance and behavior that were completely inappropriate for childcare workers. I heard Jake mention Emma specifically, describing her as responsive and discussing how he planned to work with her during the next day's activities. Marcus was talking about organizing a special movie night for selected children that would take place in a smaller, more private room, and their tone suggested that this event was being planned for purposes that had nothing to do with legitimate childcare. I realized that my daughter had likely been targeted as a victim, and that these predators were using the trusted Disney brand as cover for their criminal activities. That night, I sat down with Emma and had a serious conversation about what had happened during her time in the children's program. Using age-appropriate language and being careful not to traumatize her further, I asked her to tell me about her interactions with the counselors and whether anyone had done anything that made her feel uncomfortable. What she told me confirmed my worst fears and made me physically ill. Jake had touched her inappropriately during what he called special games, and he had taken photos of her that she instinctively knew were wrong, even though she couldn't articulate why. He had told her that these activities were normal parts of the Disney program, but that they needed to be kept secret from parents because adults wouldn't understand how special and fun they were. Emma had been too confused and frightened to say anything initially, but her child's instinct that something was wrong had made her refuse to return to the program. I realized that if I hadn't noticed her behavioral changes and investigated further, she could have been subjected to escalating abuse throughout the remainder of our cruise. I immediately contacted ship security to report what Emma had told me, but their response was even more disturbing than the original incident. The security officer I spoke with seemed more concerned about protecting the cruise line's reputation than investigating serious allegations of child abuse. He suggested that children often make up stories or misinterpret normal adult behavior, and he questioned whether Emma's account was reliable given her young age and the stressful environment of being on a cruise ship. When I demanded that they investigate Jake and the other counselors I had observed, I was told that any formal investigation would require contacting law enforcement authorities at our next port of call, which could result in significant delays and complications for all passengers. The security officer strongly suggested that I reconsider filing a formal complaint, implying that doing so would ruin not only my family's vacation, but the vacations of hundreds of other passengers who would be inconvenienced by the investigation process. Frustrated by the lack of response from ship security, I decided to take matters into my own hands and gather more evidence of the predatory behavior I had witnessed. Using my phone, I began discreetly recording interactions between the male counselors and children during public activities, documenting the inappropriate touching and positioning I had observed. I also took photos of the staff members involved so that I could provide clear identification to authorities once we returned to port. However, my investigation efforts were quickly discovered by the cruise staff, and I found myself being watched and followed by security personnel who seemed determined to prevent me from gathering additional evidence. My cabin was searched while I was away, ostensibly as part of routine safety inspections, but it was clear that they were looking for any recordings or photos I might have taken. The harassment and intimidation became so intense that I began to fear for my family's safety, wondering if the cruise line would go to extreme lengths to prevent their criminal conspiracy from being exposed. The remainder of our cruise became a nightmare of paranoia and fear as I tried to protect my children while documenting evidence of abuse and cover-up. I discovered that Jake and his associates had been working on Disney cruises for years, moving between different ships in the fleet and leaving behind a trail of victimized children whose parents either never discovered the abuse or were silenced by the company's legal and public relations machinery. I learned from other parents that several children had experienced similar problems during previous cruises, but their complaints had been dismissed or suppressed through a combination of intimidation, legal threats, and financial settlements that included non-disclosure agreements. The Disney Corporation's reputation for family-friendly entertainment provided perfect cover for predators who could exploit parental trust and corporate protection to access vulnerable victims. I realized that Emma and Tyler were just the latest in a long line of children who had been harmed by a system that prioritized profit and reputation over child safety. When we finally returned to port in Miami, I immediately contacted local law enforcement and child protective services to report what had happened during our cruise. However, the investigation process proved to be incredibly frustrating and ultimately ineffective. The cruise line's legal team worked aggressively to discredit my testimony and suppress the evidence I had gathered, claiming that I was an unstable single mother who was trying to extort money from Disney through false accusations. They produced character witnesses who testified that Jake and the other counselors were exemplary employees, and they presented alternative explanations for Emma's behavioral changes that attributed them to normal childhood stress rather than abuse. The photos and recordings I had taken were dismissed as being taken out of context or manipulated to support my preconceived conclusions. Despite clear evidence of inappropriate behavior, the criminal investigation was closed without charges being filed. And the only consequence for the perpetrators was their quiet transfer to other positions within the Disney Corporation, where they would have access to different groups of potential victims. The civil lawsuit I filed against Disney was eventually settled out of court for a sum that barely covered my legal expenses and therapy costs for Emma, who continues to struggle with trust issues and anxiety related to her traumatic experience. The settlement agreement included a strict non-disclosure clause that prevents me from publicly discussing the specific details of what happened during our cruise. But it doesn't prevent me from speaking in general terms about the dangers that children face in environments where predators can operate with institutional protection. Emma is now in her early teens, and she still has nightmares about that cruise and struggles with anxiety in social situations involving unfamiliar adults. The experience taught me that no corporation, no matter how trusted or family-friendly their reputation, can be relied upon to prioritize child safety over their own financial interests. I've become an advocate for stronger oversight of cruise ship activities and better protection for children in travel and entertainment environments. But I know that there are still predators out there using positions of trust and corporate protection to access and harm vulnerable children. The fact that Jake and his associates were never prosecuted and were simply moved to other positions where they could continue their predatory behavior haunts me every day. And I live with the knowledge that other families are probably experiencing the same nightmare that destroyed my faith in corporate America and my children's sense of safety in the world. My name is Adeline, and I was 22 years old when I booked my first cruise in March 2022, celebrating my graduation from college with what I thought would be a relaxing solo trip to the Western Caribbean. As a broke college student, I had saved every penny for 2 years to afford even the cheapest interior cabin on the Carnival Freedom, a tiny windowless room on deck 2 that was barely larger than a closet. I didn't care about the lack of amenities or natural light because I planned to spend most of my time exploring the ship and enjoying the destinations, using my cabin only for sleeping and storing my belongings. What started as an adventure in independence and self-discovery quickly became a terrifying ordeal that made me question my safety and sanity, as I realized that someone with access to my room was watching my every move and had plans for me that went far beyond simple harassment or theft. The first sign that something was wrong came on my second night aboard the ship, when I returned to my cabin around 11 p.m. after spending the evening at one of the ship's lounges. As I opened my cabin door, I immediately noticed that things weren't quite the way I had left them. My suitcase, which I had positioned at the foot of the bed, was now several inches to the left, and my toiletries on the bathroom counter had been rearranged in a subtle but noticeable way. At first, I assumed that housekeeping had been in my room and had simply moved things while cleaning. But something about the changes felt more deliberate and invasive than routine maintenance would explain. I called the front desk to ask if housekeeping had visited my cabin that evening, and I was told that all cleaning services had been completed by early afternoon, well before I had left my room for dinner. The customer service representative suggested that I might have simply forgotten exactly how I had arranged my belongings, but I knew with absolute certainty that someone had been in my cabin and had deliberately moved my personal items. Over the next few days, the intrusions became more frequent and more disturbing. I would return to my cabin to find that my clothes had been touched and rearranged, with intimate items like underwear and bras moved to more prominent positions as if someone had been examining them closely. My laptop, which I always left closed and positioned in a specific way on the small desk, would be found slightly open with the screen angled differently than I remembered. Most unsettling was the discovery that someone had been going through my phone while I was away from the cabin, as evidenced by apps being left open that I hadn't used and photos being viewed that I hadn't accessed recently. I began taking detailed photos of my cabin arrangement before leaving each day, documenting the exact position of every item so I could prove to myself that I wasn't imagining the intrusions. The evidence was undeniable. Someone with access to my room was regularly entering when I was away and systematically examining my personal belongings. I reported these incidents to ship security multiple times, but their response was frustratingly dismissive and unhelpful. The security officers suggested that I was probably experiencing stress from traveling alone and might be misremembering how I had arranged my belongings. They claimed that only authorized housekeeping staff had access to passenger cabins, and that all crew members underwent extensive background checks that would prevent anyone with criminal intentions from working on the ship. When I insisted that someone was definitely entering my cabin without permission, they offered to review security footage from the corridor outside my room. But they claimed that the cameras had malfunctioned during the specific time periods when the intrusions had occurred. The coincidence seemed impossible, but they maintained that technical difficulties with surveillance equipment were common on cruise ships and that there was no evidence of unauthorized entry into my cabin. Their refusal to take my concerns seriously made me realize that I was completely on my own in dealing with whatever was happening to me. The situation escalated dramatically on my fifth night aboard the ship, when I decided to return to my cabin unexpectedly early from dinner to see if I could catch the intruder in the act. As I approached my corridor around 9 p.m., I saw a figure in a crew uniform using a key card to enter my cabin. The person was wearing the standard maintenance uniform and appeared to be of average height and build, but they moved quickly and kept their head down in a way that prevented me from seeing their face clearly. I hid around the corner and waited for several minutes, watching as they remained inside my room for what seemed like an eternity. When they finally emerged, they looked directly in my direction as if they had somehow sensed my presence. and although I couldn't make out their features in the dim corridor lighting, I could feel their eyes on me in a way that made my blood run cold. They walked away calmly and confidently, as if they had every right to be in my cabin, and I realized that this wasn't a random crime of opportunity, but a deliberate and systematic stalking operation. I waited until the person was completely out of sight before entering my cabin, and what I found inside made me physically sick with fear and revulsion. My personal items had been arranged in a way that was clearly intended to send a message, with my underwear and intimate clothing laid out on the bed in patterns that suggested sexual obsession. My phone had been connected to the charging cable and positioned on the pillow next to where my head would rest, as if the intruder wanted me to know that they had been accessing my private information and communication. Most disturbing was the discovery of several photos printed from my social media accounts that had been placed throughout the cabin, showing me in various locations both on the ship and from my life back home. The photos had been annotated with handwritten notes that commented on my appearance and activities in ways that revealed an intimate knowledge of my personal life and daily routines. I realized that someone had been researching me extensively and had been planning this stalking operation probably since before I had even boarded the ship. The notes and photos revealed details about my life that were genuinely frightening in their specificity and accuracy. The stalker knew where I lived, where I worked, what car I drove, and even details about my family members and friends that weren't publicly available on social media. They had somehow accessed private information about my cruise reservation, including my cabin number and itinerary, and they had used this information to prepare for what appeared to be an escalating campaign of harassment and intimidation. One of the notes mentioned that they knew I was traveling alone and had no one to protect me, while another described specific sexual acts they wanted to perform with me in graphic detail that made me feel physically ill. The level of planning and preparation evident in these materials made it clear that I was dealing with someone who was seriously disturbed and potentially dangerous. Not just a crew member taking advantage of access to passenger cabins for petty theft or pranks. I gathered all of the evidence I could find and immediately went to the ship's security office, demanding to speak with the highest-ranking officer available. This time, I refused to accept dismissive responses or technical excuses, and I insisted that they take immediate action to protect me from what was clearly a dangerous stalker. The security chief, a man named Rodriguez, seemed more concerned about the potential liability issues for the cruise line than about my personal safety, and he suggested that the best solution would be to move me to a different cabin for the remainder of the cruise. However, when I asked how they could guarantee that my stalker wouldn't have access to the new cabin, he couldn't provide any assurance that the same crew member responsible for the harassment wouldn't simply continue targeting me in a different location. He also couldn't explain how they would prevent the stalker from following me to public areas of the ship or from accessing information about my new cabin assignment through whatever means they had used to obtain my original reservation details. The final 2 days of my cruise were an absolute nightmare of fear and paranoia, as I realized that I was trapped on a ship with someone who had unlimited access to my living space and who was becoming increasingly bold in their stalking behavior. I barely slept during those final nights, barricading my cabin door with furniture and staying awake to listen for any sounds that might indicate someone was trying to enter. I avoided being alone anywhere on the ship, staying in crowded public areas during the day and following groups of other passengers whenever possible to avoid being isolated where my stalker could approach me. Despite these precautions, I continued to find evidence that I was being watched and followed, including notes slipped under my cabin door and personal items that went missing from my room, only to reappear in different locations, with clear signs that they had been handled and examined. The psychological pressure of being continuously watched and threatened while trapped in the middle of the ocean with no means of escape was more terrifying than any physical assault could have been. When I finally spoke with other passengers about my experience, I discovered that I wasn't the only young woman who had experienced similar problems during the cruise. Several other solo female travelers mentioned feeling like they were being watched or followed, and one woman told me that her cabin had been entered repeatedly despite her complaints to security. Another passenger mentioned that she had received anonymous messages on her phone from someone who seemed to know details about her activities and whereabouts on the ship. The pattern of similar incidents suggested that this wasn't an isolated case of one disturbed crew member, but possibly a more systematic problem with staff members targeting vulnerable female passengers for harassment and stalking. The cruise line's apparent unwillingness to take these incidents seriously or to implement effective security measures made it clear that they were more concerned about protecting their reputation and avoiding liability than about ensuring passenger safety. The investigation I demanded was eventually conducted, but it was obviously designed to protect the cruise line rather than identify and prosecute the perpetrator. Security officers claimed that their review of personnel records and interviews with crew members had failed to identify anyone who could have been responsible for the stalking incidents. They suggested that I might have been the victim of a random crime committed by someone who had somehow obtained unauthorized access to crew key cards, making it impossible to trace the perpetrator through normal security protocols. The evidence I had collected, including the photos and handwritten notes, was dismissed as being potentially fabricated or obtained through other means. And the cruise line's legal team suggested that pursuing the matter further could result in defamation charges if I couldn't prove my allegations in court. The message was clear. They wanted me to drop the matter and accept that nothing would be done to identify or punish the person who had terrorized me throughout my cruise. When I returned home, I contacted local law enforcement and tried to pursue criminal charges against the unknown stalker. But the jurisdictional complications of crimes committed in international waters made prosecution nearly impossible. The FBI agent I spoke with explained that maritime crimes were extremely difficult to investigate and prosecute, especially when the perpetrator couldn't be identified and the cruise line wasn't cooperating with the investigation. The photos and notes I had collected as evidence disappeared from my luggage during the disembarkation process, leaving me with no physical proof of what had happened during my cruise. I was left with only my testimony and the psychological trauma of knowing that someone with intimate knowledge of my personal life had spent a week stalking and terrorizing me while the cruise line staff either couldn't or wouldn't protect me from their own employee. The experience destroyed my sense of personal safety and made me realize how vulnerable solo travelers, especially young women, can be when they place their trust in corporations that prioritize profit over passenger protection. I still have nightmares about being trapped on that ship with someone watching my every move. And I've never been able to enjoy traveling alone since that terrifying week in the Caribbean when I learned that the people we trust to keep us safe during our vacations might be the very ones we need protection from. My name is Evan, and I'm a 31-year-old marine engineer who has worked on commercial vessels for over a decade, specializing in the massive diesel engines that power cruise ships and cargo vessels across the world's oceans. In November 2017, I was contracted to work aboard an MSC cruise ship during its Baltic Sea route, a routine assignment that should have been nothing more than standard maintenance and monitoring of the ship's propulsion systems. What I witnessed during that 2-week voyage was a catastrophic mechanical failure that killed 2 of my fellow crew members, followed by a corporate cover-up so extensive and ruthless that it changed everything I believed about maritime safety and the value that cruise lines place on human life. The incident that would haunt me for the rest of my career began on our 6th day at sea. When we were approximately 200 miles off the coast of Norway, in some of the roughest waters I had ever experienced during my time working cruise ships. The ship's main engine room housed 4 massive diesel engines, each one capable of generating over 20,000 horsepower, and weighing more than a loaded tractor trailer. These engines operated under extreme conditions, with internal temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit and pressures that could crush a human body in seconds if something went wrong with the containment systems. As the senior engineer on duty that morning, I was responsible for monitoring engine performance and ensuring that all safety protocols were being followed by the maintenance crew working in the engine room. The first sign of trouble came around 10:30 a.m. when I noticed unusual vibrations coming from engine number 3 that suggested a potential problem with the massive connecting rods that transfer power from the pistons to the crankshaft. These connecting rods are under tremendous stress during normal operation, and any weakness or fatigue in the metal can lead to catastrophic failure that sends shrapnel flying through the engine room at velocities that can penetrate steel bulkheads. I immediately ordered a shutdown of engine number 3 so we could conduct a thorough inspection of the connecting rod assembly. But the ship's chief engineer, a man named Captain Larson, who had been working for MSC for over 20 years, overruled my decision and ordered the engine to remain online. He claimed that we were behind schedule and couldn't afford the time it would take to properly inspect and repair whatever was causing the vibrations, and he insisted that the engine could continue operating safely until we reached our next port in Stockholm. When I explained that the vibration patterns I was observing indicated a high probability of catastrophic failure that could kill anyone working in the engine room, he dismissed my concerns as overcautious and threatened to have me removed from the ship if I didn't follow his orders to keep all engines operating at full capacity. The conversation was witnessed by several other crew members, including 2 mechanics named Rodriguez and Thompson, who would be dead within hours because of Captain Larson's decision to prioritize the crew's schedule over crew safety. The catastrophic failure occurred at exactly 2:15 p.m., when engine number 3 suffered a complete connecting rod failure that sent a piece of metal weighing over 400 pounds flying across the engine room at a velocity that later investigations estimated exceeded 300 miles per hour. The projectile struck Rodriguez in the chest, killing him instantly and severing his body nearly in half before embedding itself in the steel bulkhead on the opposite side of the engine room. The secondary explosion that followed when the damaged engine ruptured its fuel lines created a fireball that engulfed the entire engine compartment, trapping Thompson in a section where the fire suppression systems had been damaged by flying debris from the initial failure. I watched helplessly as Thompson burned to death, his screams echoing through the engine room as the automatic fire suppression systems failed to activate because the control lines had been severed by the same projectile that had killed Rodriguez. The heat from the fire was so intense that it began melting the steel bulkheads, and the toxic smoke from burning diesel fuel and lubricating oil made it impossible for rescue teams to reach Thompson before he died from smoke inhalation and thermal injuries. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Captain Larson took complete control of the situation in ways that made it clear he was more concerned about protecting MSC's reputation than investigating the cause of the accident or ensuring that similar failures couldn't happen on other ships in the fleet. Within minutes of the explosion, he had ordered all surviving crew members out of the engine room and had sealed the compartment, claiming that it was too dangerous for anyone to enter until specialized equipment could be brought aboard at our next port. He then called a meeting of all engineering staff and informed us that we were not to discuss the incident with anyone, including other crew members, passengers, or authorities, until the company's investigation team could arrive to assess the situation. When I pointed out that maritime law required immediate reporting of fatal accidents to Coast Guard authorities, he told me that the company's legal department would handle all communication with regulatory agencies, and that unauthorized disclosure of information about the accident could result in criminal charges for violating confidentiality agreements that all crew members had signed as part of their employment contracts. Over the next several days, I watched as Captain Larson and a team of MSC corporate representatives systematically destroyed evidence of the mechanical failure and replaced it with fabricated documentation that supported a completely different narrative about what had caused the explosion. The damaged connecting rod that had caused the initial failure was removed from the engine room and disposed of overboard during the night watch, replaced with a different component that showed no signs of the metal fatigue that I had identified in my inspection reports. My original maintenance logs documenting the vibrations and my recommendations for engine shutdown were confiscated and destroyed, replaced with falsified records that showed no indication of mechanical problems prior to the accident. The ship's automatic data recording systems, which should have provided independent verification of engine performance and operating conditions, were found to have mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact time period when the failure occurred, eliminating any electronic evidence that could contradict the company's version of events. The official investigation report prepared by MSC's Internal Safety Department concluded that the explosion had been caused by human error rather than mechanical failure, specifically claiming that Rodriguez and Thompson had been performing unauthorized maintenance procedures that had caused them to accidentally damage critical engine components. The report stated that both men had violated established safety protocols by working on pressurized systems without proper authorization, and that their deaths were the result of their own negligence rather than any failure of company equipment or management oversight. This narrative was completely fabricated. Both Rodriguez and Thompson had been following standard maintenance procedures under my direct supervision, and the connecting rod failure that actually caused the explosion was the result of metal fatigue that had been developing over months or years of operation, under conditions that exceeded the engine's design specifications. The company's willingness to destroy the reputations of two dead men in order to avoid responsibility for their deaths was more disturbing to me than the original mechanical failure that had killed them. When I attempted to contact maritime safety authorities to report the cover-up and provide accurate information about the cause of the accident, I discovered that MSC's legal team had already been in communication with regulatory agencies in multiple countries, providing their falsified version of events and portraying me as a disgruntled employee who was trying to blame the company for an accident that had been caused by crew negligence. My engineering credentials were questioned, my competence was challenged, and I was accused of attempting to extort money from MSC by threatening to make false accusations unless I received financial compensation for keeping quiet about the accident. The company's legal resources were virtually unlimited, and they were able to present a coordinated defense that made it extremely difficult for outside investigators to determine what had actually happened in the engine room. During those critical moments when two men died because of corporate negligence and cost-cutting measures that had left the ship operating with equipment that was fundamentally unsafe. The psychological impact of watching two colleagues die in a preventable accident and then being forced to participate in covering up the circumstances of their deaths was devastating to my mental health and my faith in the maritime industry that had been my career for over a decade. I began experiencing severe anxiety and depression, along with recurring nightmares about the explosion and the sound of Thompson's screams as he burned to death while I stood helpless to save him. The knowledge that similar mechanical failures were probably occurring on other ships in the MSC fleet, and that other crew members were likely dying in accidents that were being covered up and blamed on human error, made it impossible for me to continue working in an industry that I now knew valued profit margins more than human lives. I sought treatment from mental health professionals, but the confidentiality agreements I had signed as part of my employment made it difficult to discuss the specific details of what I had witnessed, limiting the effectiveness of therapy and prolonging my recovery from the trauma. The final betrayal came when I was terminated from my position with MSC and found myself effectively blacklisted from working for other cruise lines or shipping companies throughout the maritime industry. My employment record was flagged with notations suggesting that I was unreliable, prone to making false accusations, and potentially dangerous to work with, making it virtually impossible for me to find employment in my chosen field. The company's influence within the maritime industry was so extensive that even shipping companies that had no direct relationship with MSC were reluctant to hire me after receiving unofficial warnings about my supposed tendency to cause trouble for employers. I was forced to completely change careers and start over in a different industry, abandoning over a decade of specialized training and experience, because I had tried to tell the truth about an accident that could have been prevented if corporate executives had prioritized safety over scheduling pressures and cost considerations. Years after the incident, I still struggle with the knowledge that Rodriguez and Thompson died unnecessarily, and that their families never learned the truth about why their loved ones were killed while working for a company that claimed to prioritize crew safety above all other considerations. The mechanical failure that caused their deaths was entirely preventable and would have been avoided if MSC had been willing to invest in proper maintenance procedures and equipment upgrades rather than operating their ships at the absolute limits of mechanical tolerance in order to maximize profitability. The cover-up that followed demonstrated the extent to which cruise lines are willing to go to protect their reputations and avoid the financial consequences of acknowledging safety failures, even when those failures result in the deaths of their own employees. I know that similar accidents are continuing to occur throughout the cruise industry, and that crew members are dying in incidents that are being systematically covered up and blamed on human error rather than corporate negligence. But my experience with MSC's legal team taught me that individual whistleblowers have virtually no power to challenge the vast resources and influence that these companies can bring to bear against anyone who threatens their carefully constructed public image of safety and reliability. My name is Ariana, and I was 19 years old when I signed my first contract to work on a Princess cruise ship in the summer of 2019, desperate to earn money for college and see the world at the same time. As a naive kid from a small town in Ohio, I thought working on a cruise ship would be like being paid to live on a floating resort, with opportunities to visit exotic destinations and meet interesting people from around the globe. The reality of crew life aboard the Pacific Princess during our Alaska route was nothing like the glamorous adventure I had imagined. But it wasn't until I was assigned late-night cleaning duties in the ship's medical area that I discovered just how dark and criminal the world of cruise ship employment could really be. What started as a summer job to pay for college tuition became a nightmare that taught me more about human corruption and corporate crime than any classroom ever could, and left me with knowledge that I carry like a burden to this day. My official job title was cabin steward, which meant I was responsible for cleaning passenger staterooms and maintaining the public areas on several decks of the ship. The work was exhausting and never-ending, with shifts that often lasted 14 hours a day and barely enough time off to sleep and eat between cleaning cycles. As one of the newest and youngest crew members, I was frequently assigned the worst duties and least desirable shifts, including the overnight cleaning rotation that took me into areas of the ship that most crew members never saw. The medical bay was one of these restricted areas, located on Deck 3 in a section that was completely off-limits to passengers and accessible only to crew members with special clearance cards. I'd been working on the ship for about 6 weeks when I was assigned to deep clean the medical facilities during the graveyard shift, a task that was supposed to be routine maintenance, but turned into the most terrifying experience of my young life. The medical bay consisted of several examination rooms, a small pharmacy, and a storage area that contained medical supplies and equipment. During my first night cleaning the facility, everything seemed normal, and I completed my assigned tasks without incident. However, on my second night in the medical area, I noticed unusual activity that immediately struck me as suspicious and potentially dangerous. Around 2:30 in the morning, I observed several crew members who weren't part of the medical staff entering the pharmacy area with large bags and containers. They were working quickly and quietly, and their behavior suggested that they were engaged in activities that they didn't want to be discovered. When I tried to get a closer look at what they were doing, I realized that they were systematically removing prescription medications from the pharmacy's storage cabinets and repackaging them into unmarked containers that they carried away in their bags. At first, I assumed that I was witnessing some kind of legitimate medical procedure or inventory management that I simply didn't understand because of my limited experience working on cruise ships. However, as I continued to observe these activities over several nights, it became clear that what I was seeing was organized theft of prescription medications on a massive scale. The crew members involved in the operation included people from various departments throughout the ship, including housekeeping supervisors, food service workers, and even some of the junior officers who had access to restricted areas. They had developed a sophisticated system for removing drugs from the medical storage areas and replacing them with placebos or expired medications that looked identical to the original prescriptions but had no therapeutic value for passengers who needed genuine medical treatment. The full scope of the operation became apparent when I accidentally stumbled upon a conversation between two of the crew members involved in the drug theft ring. They were discussing how they had been selling stolen medications to contacts at various ports along our route, generating thousands of dollars in profit that was being shared among the participants in the conspiracy. More disturbing was their casual discussion of how they were replacing vital medications like heart drugs, insulin, and pain relievers with fake substitutes that could potentially kill passengers who depended on those medications for their health and survival. They talked about several passengers who had died during previous cruises after receiving fake medications from the ship's medical staff. Deaths that had been attributed to natural causes rather than the criminal negligence that had actually killed them. When I realized the full extent of what I was witnessing, I knew that I had to report the criminal activity to ship authorities. But I also understood that some of the people involved in the drug trafficking operation held positions of authority that would make it dangerous for me to come forward as a whistleblower. I decided to document everything I could observe. Using my phone to take photos and videos of the crew members removing medications from the pharmacy and repackaging them for sale, I also began keeping detailed written notes about the times, dates, and specific individuals involved in the operation, hoping that I could eventually present this evidence to law enforcement authorities once we returned to port. However, my attempts to gather evidence were discovered by the criminals, and I quickly found myself in a situation where my safety and possibly my life were at risk. The confrontation came during my 4th week of observing the drug trafficking operation, when I was caught photographing one of the crew members repackaging stolen insulin that was desperately needed by diabetic passengers aboard the ship. The man who caught me was Rodriguez, a housekeeping supervisor who had been working for Princess for several years and seemed to be one of the leaders of the criminal operation. Instead of trying to explain away what he was doing or deny his involvement in the drug theft, Rodriguez immediately threatened me with violence if I reported what I had seen to anyone in authority. He told me that several crew members who had discovered the operation in the past had suffered accidents that had either killed them or left them so badly injured that they were unable to work and had been quietly discharged from the ship at remote ports where they couldn't get help from authorities. Rodriguez made it clear that I had 2 choices. I could either join the criminal operation and share in the profits from selling stolen medications, or I could suffer the same fate as the previous crew members who had tried to expose the drug trafficking ring. To demonstrate that his threats were serious, he showed me photos on his phone of crew members who had been beaten, stabbed, and in one case apparently thrown overboard after they had refused to participate in the criminal conspiracy or had threatened to report it to authorities. The photos were horrifying evidence of violence that had been inflicted on people who had tried to do the right thing. And Rodriguez made it clear that he had no qualms about ordering similar violence against me if I didn't cooperate with his demands. Faced with the choice between participating in criminal activity that was potentially killing innocent passengers or risking my own life by refusing to cooperate, I made the decision to pretend to go along with the operation while secretly planning to escape from the ship and report everything to law enforcement at our next port. Rodriguez assigned me specific tasks within the drug trafficking operation, including helping to repackage stolen medications and disposing of evidence that could link the crew members to the thefts. As I participated in these activities, I continued to document everything I could, taking additional photos and gathering more detailed information about how the operation worked and who was involved at various levels of the conspiracy. The most horrifying aspect of the drug trafficking ring was learning about the passengers who had died as a direct result of receiving fake medications instead of the life-saving treatments they needed. Rodriguez and the other criminals kept detailed records of their activities, including lists of passengers who had been given placebos instead of real medications and the dates when those passengers had subsequently died from medical emergencies that could have been prevented with proper treatment. I saw documentation of diabetic passengers who had died from insulin shock after receiving fake insulin, heart patients who had suffered fatal cardiac events after their heart medications were replaced with sugar pills, and cancer patients who had died agonizing deaths after their pain medications were stolen and replaced with worthless substitutes. The criminal operation had been going on for years across multiple ships in the Princess Fleet, with crew members being transferred between vessels to spread the drug trafficking network throughout the cruise line's operations. The profits from selling stolen medications were enormous, with some individual crew members earning more from drug trafficking than they made from their legitimate cruise ship salaries. The operation was protected by a network of corrupt officers and supervisors who received portions of the profits in exchange for their silence and cooperation in covering up the crimes. Passengers who complained about ineffective medications or medical treatment were dismissed as hypochondriacs or drug seekers, and their deaths were routinely attributed to pre-existing conditions rather than the criminal negligence that had actually killed them. My escape from the criminal operation came when we docked in Juneau, Alaska, and I was able to slip away from the ship during a brief shore leave period. I immediately went to local law enforcement authorities and turned over all of the evidence I had gathered documenting the drug trafficking ring and the murders that had resulted from passengers receiving fake medications. However, the investigation that followed was complicated by jurisdictional issues and the cruise line's legal resources, which were used to discredit my testimony and suppress evidence of criminal activity. Several of the crew members I had identified as participants in the drug trafficking operation mysteriously disappeared from the ship before investigators could interview them, and key evidence from the ship's pharmacy was destroyed or went missing during the investigation process. Despite the obstacles created by Princess's legal team and the difficulties of investigating crimes that had occurred in international waters, my testimony eventually led to a federal investigation that uncovered evidence of systematic drug trafficking and patient endangerment across multiple cruise ships. However, the criminal charges that were eventually filed were relatively minor compared to the scope of the crimes that had been committed, and most of the crew members involved in the operation received plea bargains that resulted in short prison sentences and financial penalties that were insignificant compared to the profits they had made from selling stolen medications. The cruise line itself faced only regulatory sanctions and civil lawsuits that amounted to little more than the cost of doing business. And there was no meaningful reform of the systems that had allowed the criminal operation to flourish for years without detection. The experience of working on that cruise ship and discovering the drug trafficking operation changed my entire perspective on corporate crime and the vulnerability of ordinary people who trust large companies with their safety and well-being. I realized that the passengers who had died from receiving fake medications had trusted Princess to provide them with legitimate medical care, never imagining that crew members were stealing their medications and replacing them with worthless placebos that would kill them. The fact that this criminal operation had been allowed to continue for years, with dozens of passengers dying preventable deaths, demonstrated the extent to which cruise lines prioritize profits over passenger safety and the lives of the people who trust them with their vacations and their health. I never returned to work on cruise ships after that summer, and I still have nightmares about the passengers who died because of the greed and criminality of people who were supposed to be taking care of them during what should have been the happiest times of their lives. My name is Ariella, and I was just 16 years old when I boarded the Holland America cruise ship Westerdam with my grandparents in July 2021. Excited about what I thought would be a relaxing family vacation along the Pacific coast. As a teenager who had grown up with social media and smartphones, I was constantly connected to the internet and spent most of my free time chatting with friends online and sharing photos of my daily activities. What started as innocent vacation posts and casual conversations with new online friends quickly escalated into a nightmare that taught me how dangerous the digital world can be, especially when predators have physical access to your location and can use technology to turn a cruise ship into an inescapable prison. The horror began on my second day at sea, when I connected to the ship's Wi-Fi network and started sharing photos and updates about my cruise experience with my followers on various social media platforms. I had always been careful about online safety, never sharing personal information like my home address or school name with strangers on the internet. But the excitement of being on my first major cruise made me less cautious than usual about posting location-specific content. I shared photos of my cabin, the ship's pools and restaurants, and scenic views from our route along the California and Oregon coastlines. I also joined several chat rooms and messaging apps that were popular with cruise ship passengers, where people would share tips about onboard activities and coordinate group meetups at various locations throughout the ship. It seemed like a harmless way to meet other travelers and enhance my cruise experience. But I had no idea that I was providing detailed information about my whereabouts and activities to someone who was using that information to track my movements and plan a systematic stalking campaign that would terrorize me for the remainder of the voyage. The first contact came through a direct message on Instagram from someone using the handle Sea Watcher, who claimed to be a fellow passenger on the Westerdam who had seen my cruise photos and wanted to meet up for activities around the ship. The profile appeared to belong to someone in their early 20s, with photos that showed a clean-cut young man in various travel destinations around the world. His messages were friendly and respectful, asking about my favorite spots on the ship and suggesting places where we might run into each other during the cruise. At first, I was flattered by the attention and excited about the possibility of making a new friend during my vacation. However, as our conversations continued, I began to notice that Sea Watcher knew more about my activities and location than someone would be able to learn from my public social media posts alone. He would mention specific details about what I had been wearing on particular days, where I'd eaten meals, and who I had been spending time with, information that could only have been gathered through direct observation rather than online stalking. When I asked him how he knew these details, he would claim that he had seen me around the ship and had been trying to work up the courage to approach me in person. Initially, I thought this explanation was plausible and even somewhat romantic. But as the messages became more frequent and more detailed, I began to realize that someone was watching me constantly and documenting my every move throughout the ship. The messages also began to take on a more threatening tone, with Sea Watcher making comments about how vulnerable I looked when I was alone, and how easy it would be for someone to approach me in isolated areas of the ship where other passengers rarely ventured. The situation became genuinely terrifying when Sea Watcher began sending me photos that he claimed to have taken of me during the cruise, images that showed me in locations and situations where I had no memory of seeing anyone with a camera or phone pointed in my direction. The photos were taken from concealed positions and angles that suggested someone had been hiding while taking them. And some of the images captured me in private moments when I thought I was unobserved. One photo showed me on my cabin's balcony in my pajamas, taken from a position that could only have been accessed by someone with unauthorized access to restricted areas of the ship. Another image had been taken while I was swimming in one of the ship's pools, shot from below the waterline in a way that was clearly intended to capture inappropriate content for sexual purposes. When I tried to block Sea Watcher on Instagram and other social media platforms, the messages simply moved to different accounts and platforms, demonstrating that this person had access to multiple identities and was prepared to continue the harassment through whatever means necessary. The messages also began appearing on messaging apps that I hadn't shared with anyone, suggesting that my phone had been somehow compromised or that someone was monitoring my internet activity through the ship's Wi-Fi network. Most disturbing was when Sea Watcher began sending me photos and personal information about my grandparents, including images of them in their cabin and details about their daily routines that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance of our entire family group. I finally worked up the courage to tell my grandmother about what was happening, and she immediately contacted ship security to report that I was being stalked and threatened by someone who appeared to have unauthorized access to passenger information and restricted areas of the vessel. However, the response from the security team was frustratingly inadequate and seemed designed more to minimize the cruise line's liability than to actually protect me from a dangerous predator. The security officer suggested that online harassment was a common problem among teenagers and that I was probably overreacting to normal social media interactions with other passengers. When I showed them the photos that Sea Watcher had sent me, they claimed that these images could have been taken by anyone with a camera and didn't necessarily prove that someone was engaged in systematic stalking behavior. The security team's investigation consisted mainly of asking me questions about my own online behavior and social media usage, with several officers implying that I had somehow invited the harassment by posting photos of myself and engaging in conversations with strangers on the internet. They seemed more concerned about whether I had been violating the cruise line's terms of service by sharing location-specific information than about the fact that someone was using that information to stalk and threaten a minor passenger. When I asked what specific steps they were taking to identify and stop Sea Watcher, they claimed that tracking online harassment was extremely difficult in international waters and that they didn't have the technical resources to investigate cyber crimes that involved multiple social media platforms and messaging apps. The harassment escalated dramatically after I reported it to security, suggesting that Sea Watcher either had access to information about my complaint or was connected to someone within the ship's staff who was keeping him informed about the investigation. The messages became more explicit and threatening, with detailed descriptions of sexual violence that the stalker claimed he wanted to inflict on me and my grandmother. He began sending photos of weapons that he claimed to have brought aboard the ship, along with detailed plans for how he intended to gain access to our cabin and assault us while the ship was in international waters where law enforcement response would be delayed or impossible. The messages also included information about our travel plans after the cruise, including flight numbers and hotel reservations that weren't publicly available and could only have been accessed through cruise line databases or by someone with connections to travel industry professionals. My grandmother and I spent the final days of our cruise in a state of constant fear and paranoia, afraid to leave our cabin except when absolutely necessary, and never traveling anywhere on the ship alone. We changed our daily routines completely, avoiding the public areas and activities that we had been enjoying earlier in the voyage. and we began eating all of our meals through room service to minimize our exposure to other passengers and crew members. Despite these precautions, we continued to receive evidence that we were being watched and followed, including photos that showed us in supposedly secure areas of the ship and messages that described our conversations and activities in real time as they were happening. The psychological pressure of being constantly surveilled by an unknown predator while trapped on a ship in the middle of the ocean was more terrifying than any physical threat could have been. The most disturbing revelation came when Sea Watcher revealed that he wasn't working alone, but was part of a network of crew members and passengers who were collaborating to identify and target vulnerable travelers for harassment and abuse. He sent me screenshots of group chats where multiple people were sharing photos and personal information about female passengers, rating their attractiveness and discussing strategies for approaching them or gaining access to their cabins. The conversations revealed that this predatory network had been operating on Holland America's ships for years, with participants sharing information and coordinating activities across multiple cruises and itineraries. Some of the messages discussed previous victims who had been sexually assaulted or who had simply disappeared during cruises, with the perpetrators expressing satisfaction about getting away with serious crimes because of the jurisdictional complications involved in investigating incidents that occur in international waters. When we finally disembarked in Los Angeles, I immediately turned over all of the evidence I had collected to FBI agents who were waiting at the port. But the investigation that followed was hampered by the same jurisdictional issues and technical limitations that had prevented ship security from taking effective action during the cruise. The multiple social media accounts used by Sea Watcher had been created with false information and had been accessed through proxy servers that made it nearly impossible to trace their origin or identify the person responsible for the harassment. The photos and videos that had been sent to me had been stripped of metadata that could have revealed when and where they were taken. And the messaging platforms that had been used to communicate with me had policies that prevented law enforcement from accessing user information without extensive legal proceedings that could take months or years to complete. Holland America's cooperation with the investigation was minimal and seemed designed primarily to protect the cruise line's reputation rather than help identify the predators who were operating on their ships. The company's legal team claimed that they had no responsibility for criminal activity conducted by passengers or crew members using third-party internet services. And they argued that online harassment was outside the scope of their security obligations to passengers. They refused to provide passenger and crew lists that could have helped investigators identify potential suspects, citing privacy concerns and corporate policies that prevented sharing customer information with law enforcement agencies. The cruise line also claimed that their Wi-Fi network logs were automatically deleted after short periods and were therefore unavailable for analysis by investigators who were trying to trace the source of the harassing messages. The psychological impact of being stalked and threatened by unknown predators while trapped on a cruise ship far from any possibility of help or escape has affected my mental health and my ability to trust other people in ways that continue to impact my daily life years after the incident. I developed severe anxiety about traveling and being in unfamiliar places where I might be vulnerable to similar predatory behavior. And I became extremely cautious about my online activities and social media usage. The knowledge that there are organized networks of predators operating on cruise ships and using technology to identify and target vulnerable passengers has made me aware of dangers that most people never consider when they book what they think will be relaxing vacations on the high seas. I've become an advocate for stronger cybersecurity measures and better coordination between cruise lines and law enforcement agencies to protect passengers from digital predators who can use technology to turn vacation ships into hunting grounds for sexual predators and other criminals who know they can operate with impunity in international waters where normal legal protections don't apply. My name is Nathaniel, And at 52 years old, I thought my 20-year career as a maritime safety officer had prepared me for every possible emergency scenario that could occur aboard a cruise ship. I had worked for various cruise lines throughout the Mediterranean, conducting safety inspections, overseeing lifeboat drills, and ensuring that all emergency equipment met international maritime safety standards. When I was hired by Virgin Voyages in early 2022 to serve as Chief Safety Officer aboard the Scarlet Lady during its Mediterranean routes, I believed I was joining a progressive cruise line that prioritized passenger safety above all other considerations. What I discovered during my routine inspection of the ship's emergency equipment was evidence of deliberate sabotage that suggested someone was planning to create a maritime disaster that would kill thousands of innocent passengers. And my attempts to prevent this catastrophe led to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the cruise industry and threatened my own life in ways I never could have imagined. The Scarlet Lady was Virgin's flagship vessel, a relatively new ship that had been designed with state-of-the-art safety systems and emergency equipment that exceeded most international maritime safety requirements. The ship carried over 2,800 passengers and crew members during peak season, making it one of the larger vessels operating in the Mediterranean market during 2022. My responsibilities included conducting weekly inspections of all safety equipment, supervising monthly lifeboat drills, and ensuring that all crew members were properly trained in emergency procedures that could save lives in the event of fire, flooding, or other disasters at sea. It was during one of these routine inspections in mid-July that I made a discovery that would change everything I thought I knew about cruise ship safety and the lengths to which criminals would go to commit mass murder for financial gain. I was conducting my standard inspection of the port-side lifeboats when I noticed that several of the emergency release mechanisms had been tampered with in ways that would prevent the boats from being properly deployed during an actual emergency. The sabotage was sophisticated and subtle, designed to look like normal wear and tear rather than deliberate criminal activity. But my years of experience with maritime safety equipment made it immediately obvious that someone with detailed technical knowledge had systematically compromised the lifeboat's ability to function when they were needed most. The release cables had been partially severed using tools that left cuts designed to look like natural metal fatigue, and several of the hydraulic systems that powered the deployment mechanisms had been drained of fluid and filled with substances that would cause complete system failure under the stress of an actual emergency deployment. As I continued my inspection, I discovered that the sabotage wasn't limited to just a few lifeboats, but extended throughout the ship's entire emergency evacuation system. Life rafts had been punctured with small holes that were sealed with temporary patches designed to fail when the rafts were inflated. Emergency communication systems had been disabled in ways that would prevent distress calls from being transmitted during a crisis. And even the ship's fire suppression systems had been compromised to ensure that fires would spread rapidly through passenger areas before effective countermeasures could be implemented. The scope and coordination of the sabotage made it clear that multiple people with access to restricted areas of the ship had been working together for an extended period to systematically destroy the safety systems that passengers depended on for their survival in emergency situations. I immediately reported my findings to the ship's captain, expecting him to order an immediate investigation and emergency repairs to restore the compromised safety systems. But his response was far more disturbing than the original sabotage I had discovered. Captain Morrison seemed more concerned about the potential impact on the cruise schedule than about the immediate danger to passenger safety. And he suggested that I might have misinterpreted normal maintenance issues as evidence of deliberate sabotage. When I insisted that the damage I had found could only have been caused by intentional criminal activity, he ordered me to prepare a confidential report that would be reviewed by the cruise line's corporate safety department. But he also instructed me not to discuss my findings with any other crew members or to take any action that might alarm passengers about potential safety issues. Over the next several days, I continued to document the extent of the sabotage while waiting for instructions from Virgin's corporate headquarters about how to proceed with repairs and investigation of the criminal activity. However, instead of receiving support for my efforts to protect passenger safety, I found myself being subjected to increasing pressure from ship management to minimize the significance of my findings and to avoid creating what they called unnecessary panic among passengers and crew. The corporate response to my detailed safety report was to send a team of company investigators who seemed more interested in discrediting my professional competence than in addressing the serious safety violations I had documented throughout the ship. The corporate investigators suggested that I might be suffering from stress-related paranoia or professional burnout that was causing me to see criminal activity where none existed. And they produced alternative explanations for each piece of evidence I had gathered that attributed the equipment failures to normal wear, manufacturing defects, or routine maintenance errors. They brought in other safety experts who contradicted my findings and suggested that the emergency equipment was functioning within acceptable parameters despite the obvious signs of sabotage that I had documented. When I refused to accept their alternative explanations and continued to insist that passengers were in immediate danger, the investigators began to question my mental stability and suggested that I might need to be relieved of my duties for psychological evaluation. The most disturbing revelation came when I accidentally overheard a conversation between Captain Morrison and one of the corporate investigators that made it clear the sabotage was not the work of unknown criminals, but part of a coordinated insurance fraud scheme that involved senior management within Virgin Voyages itself. They were discussing timeline issues related to what they called the incident, and their conversation revealed that the sabotage had been planned and executed by company employees as part of a scheme to deliberately sink the ship in a way that would appear to be an accidental maritime disaster. The insurance payout from such a disaster would be enormous, potentially exceeding the value of the ship itself, and the deaths of passengers and crew members would be written off as tragic but unavoidable casualties of a maritime accident rather than victims of premeditated mass murder. I realized that I had stumbled upon a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the cruise line's corporate hierarchy, and that my efforts to protect passenger safety were threatening a criminal scheme worth hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims. The conversation I had overheard also revealed that similar sabotage operations had been conducted on other ships in Virgin's fleet, resulting in what had been reported as accidental sinkings, but were actually deliberate acts of mass murder disguised as maritime disasters. The criminals involved in this conspiracy had been operating for years, systematically murdering passengers and crew members while collecting enormous insurance payouts and maintaining their reputations as leaders in the cruise industry. When I attempted to contact maritime safety authorities to report the criminal conspiracy, I discovered that my communications were being monitored and blocked by the ship's management, preventing me from sending distress signals or contacting outside law enforcement agencies. My cabin was searched multiple times, ostensibly for routine security inspections, but clearly designed to find and confiscate any evidence I had gathered about the sabotage and insurance fraud scheme. I was reassigned to duties that kept me away from the ship's safety equipment and prevented me from conducting further inspections that might reveal additional evidence of criminal activity. The message was clear. I was being silenced and isolated to prevent me from interfering with the planned disaster that would kill everyone aboard the Scarlet Lady. I knew that I had to find a way to warn passengers about the danger they were in, and to document evidence that could expose the criminal conspiracy even if I didn't survive the planned disaster myself. Using my knowledge of the ship's layout and security systems, I began secretly photographing the sabotaged equipment and hiding copies of my safety reports in locations throughout the ship where investigators might eventually find them. I also began discreetly warning selected passengers about potential safety issues, advising them to stay near emergency exits and to be prepared for possible evacuation scenarios. Though I couldn't reveal the full extent of the danger without risking immediate retaliation from the criminals who were controlling the ship. The planned disaster was scheduled to occur during our approach to Naples, when the ship would be in Italian territorial waters where the investigation would be handled by authorities who might be less thorough than other international maritime safety agencies. The sabotage had been timed to cause catastrophic failures during what would appear to be routine docking procedures, ensuring that the ship would sink in relatively shallow water where some evidence might be recoverable, but where the majority of passengers and crew would be trapped below deck and killed before they could escape. The location had been chosen to maximize media coverage of the disaster, while minimizing the likelihood that investigators would discover evidence of the criminal conspiracy behind the sinking. My attempts to prevent the planned disaster were ultimately unsuccessful, but not because the criminals succeeded in sinking the Scarlet Lady as they had intended. Instead, my warnings to passengers and crew members created enough awareness of potential safety issues that several people began asking questions and reporting concerns to outside authorities when we reached port in Rome. The increased scrutiny and unexpected attention from maritime safety inspectors forced the conspirators to abandon their timeline and postpone the planned disaster, giving me an opportunity to escape from the ship and contact law enforcement agencies with evidence of the criminal conspiracy. However, the investigation that followed was complicated by the cruise line's enormous legal resources and their ability to discredit witnesses and suppress evidence through corporate influence and media manipulation. The criminal charges that were eventually filed against Virgin Voyages executives and ship personnel were significantly reduced through plea bargaining and corporate legal maneuvering, resulting in sentences that were minimal compared to the scope of the crimes that had been planned, and the number of innocent lives that would have been lost if the insurance fraud scheme had succeeded. Several of the key conspirators simply disappeared during the investigation process, presumably fleeing to countries without extradition treaties where they could enjoy the profits from their previous maritime murders without facing consequences for their crimes. The Scarlet Lady itself was quietly sold to another cruise line and continued operating under a different name, with new safety equipment that replaced the sabotage systems, but with no acknowledgement of the criminal conspiracy that had nearly turned the ship into a mass grave for thousands of innocent passengers. The experience of discovering and trying to prevent a planned maritime disaster taught me that the cruise industry operates with levels of corruption and criminal activity that most passengers never imagine when they book what they think will be safe and enjoyable vacations on the high seas. The fact that senior executives within a major cruise line were willing to murder thousands of innocent people for insurance money, and that they had been successfully operating similar schemes for years without being detected, made me realize how vulnerable cruise passengers are to corporate criminals who know that maritime disasters are difficult to investigate and that the deaths of passengers in international waters can easily be attributed to accidents rather than deliberate murder. I never returned to work in the maritime industry after my experience with Virgin Voyages, but I continue to advocate for stronger oversight of cruise ship safety systems and more thorough investigation of maritime disasters that might actually be criminal conspiracies disguised as accidents. My name is Sutton, and I'm a 26-year-old woman from the Philippines who worked as a housekeeping supervisor aboard the AIDA Prima during its Northern Europe route in the summer of 2018. Like thousands of other Filipino workers, I had left my family behind to work on cruise ships, drawn by the promise of steady wages that would support my elderly parents and help pay for my younger sister's education back home. The contract I signed guaranteed decent working conditions, fair wages, and treatment that would comply with international maritime labor standards. But the reality of working below deck on a German cruise ship was a nightmare of exploitation, abuse, and systematic dehumanization that made me understand why so many crew members never return home alive from their contracts. What I witnessed and experienced during those 8 months at sea was evidence of labor practices that amounted to slavery. And when crew members began disappearing after complaining about their treatment, I realized that the cruise line was willing to commit murder to silence anyone who threatened to expose their criminal operations. The crew quarters aboard the Aida Prima were located several decks below the passenger areas, in a section of the ship that passengers never saw and that was deliberately hidden from any inspectors or authorities who might visit the vessel during port calls. My cabin, which I shared with 3 other Filipino women, was barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with bunk beds stacked so close together that we could barely sit up without hitting our heads on the ceiling or the bunk above. There were no windows, no ventilation except for a small fan that barely moved the stale air, and the walls were so thin that we could hear every sound from the neighboring cabins where other crew members were crowded into equally inhumane living conditions. The bathroom facilities were shared among 20 women, with 2 toilets and 1 shower that rarely had hot water and frequently backed up with sewage that created health hazards that would never be tolerated in any civilized country. The working conditions were even worse than the living situations, with shifts that regularly lasted 16 to 18 hours per day, 7 days a week, for the entire duration of our 8-month contracts. As housekeeping supervisor, I was responsible for ensuring that a team of 12 Filipino women cleaned over 200 passenger staterooms each day, along with public areas, crew quarters, and maintenance spaces that were never seen by passengers but were essential to the ship's operation. We were given impossible quotas that could only be met by working at a pace that was physically and mentally exhausting. And any failure to meet these quotas resulted in salary deductions, additional work assignments, or threats of contract termination that would leave us stranded in foreign ports without means to return home to our families. The systematic abuse wasn't limited to impossible working conditions and slave wages. It extended to physical and sexual violence that was tolerated and even encouraged by the ship's management as a way to maintain control over the crew workforce. Filipino women were particularly vulnerable to this abuse because our employment contracts included clauses that made it virtually impossible to leave the ship or report misconduct to outside authorities without risking deportation and permanent blacklisting from maritime employment. The German officers and supervisors who controlled our working conditions treated us as property rather than human beings, and they used their absolute power over our employment and immigration status to force us into sexual relationships and other forms of exploitation that we had no means to resist or escape. I documented the abuse and exploitation systematically, keeping detailed records of the working hours, living conditions, and incidents of violence that I witnessed during my time aboard the Aida Prima. Filipino crew members were forced to work without proper safety equipment in dangerous areas of the ship, exposed to toxic chemicals and mechanical hazards that resulted in injuries and illnesses that received no medical treatment and were not reported to maritime safety authorities. Women who became pregnant as a result of rape by officers were forced to continue working until they collapsed or were secretly taken off the ship at remote ports where their fate was unknown. Men who complained about the working conditions or tried to organize other crew members to demand better treatment were subjected to physical violence and intimidation that left them afraid to continue speaking out about the abuses they were experiencing. The disappearances began during my 4th month aboard the ship, when Maria Santos, a housekeeping worker who had been documenting the abuse and planning to report it to authorities when we reached Hamburg, simply vanished from the ship during an overnight voyage between Norwegian ports. The official explanation was that she had fallen overboard during rough weather, but several crew members had seen her being escorted to the ship's security office by German officers just hours before she was reported missing. The search for Maria was brief and perfunctory. and within days the ship's management had moved another Filipino woman into her bunk and assigned her duties to the remaining crew members as if she had never existed. Over the next several months, 6 more Filipino crew members disappeared under suspicious circumstances that were always attributed to accidents or voluntary departures that left no trace or documentation. Workers who had been vocal about the abusive conditions would suddenly be gone, with their personal belongings removed from their cabins and their names deleted from work schedules as if they had never been aboard the ship. When other crew members asked about these disappearances, they were told that the missing workers had been transferred to other ships or had requested early termination of their contracts. But no one ever received forwarding information or heard from these people again after they vanished from the Aida Prima. I realized that the missing crew members were being murdered to prevent them from exposing the labor abuses and criminal treatment that were standard operating procedures aboard the ship, and that my own documentation of these crimes made me a target for elimination. I discovered that the ship had a system for disposing of bodies that made use of the onboard waste management facilities, with human remains being processed through the same systems used to handle garbage and sewage that was discharged into the ocean during voyages in international waters. The German officers who controlled this operation had been murdering Filipino workers for years, confident that the deaths would never be investigated and that the families of the victims would never learn what had happened to their loved ones who had left home to work on cruise ships and simply disappeared. The disposal system was sophisticated and systematic, designed to eliminate any trace of the victims and make their deaths appear to be natural disappearances rather than murders. Bodies were dismembered in the ship's medical facility during night shifts, when most crew members were sleeping, then processed through industrial equipment that was normally used for food waste disposal. The remains were discharged into the ocean in areas where they would never be recovered, and the documentation of the victims was destroyed or altered to show that they had left the ship voluntarily at various ports. The officers responsible for these murders maintained detailed records of their activities, not out of remorse or accountability, but as a way to track their operations and ensure that no evidence remained that could link them to the deaths of the people they had killed. I knew that I had to escape from the ship and get my evidence to authorities who could investigate these murders and hold the criminals accountable for their actions. But I also knew that any attempt to leave the ship or contact outside law enforcement would immediately mark me for elimination. I began planning my escape during our scheduled port call in Copenhagen, where I hoped to reach Danish authorities who might be more responsive to reports of labor abuse and murder than German officials who might have connections to Aida's corporate management. I prepared detailed documentation of everything I had witnessed, including photographs of the disposal equipment, copies of work schedules that showed the impossible conditions we were forced to endure, and testimonies from other crew members who were willing to risk their lives to expose the criminal operation. My escape attempt was discovered by ship security just hours before we were scheduled to dock in Copenhagen. So Ard and I was detained in the ship's holding facility while the officers decided how to handle my knowledge of their criminal activities. I could hear them discussing whether to eliminate me immediately or wait until we were back in international waters where they could dispose of my body using their established procedures. The decision was made to keep me alive until we left port, giving me a few hours to find a way to escape or get word to authorities about what was happening aboard the Aida Prima. The intervention that saved my life came from an unexpected source. A Danish port inspector who was conducting a routine safety inspection and happened to hear my screams from the holding facility where I was being kept. When he demanded to know why a crew member was being detained against her will, the ship's officers claimed that I was being held for psychiatric evaluation after threatening to harm myself and other crew members. However, the inspector was experienced enough to recognize the signs of abuse and criminal activity, and he insisted on interviewing me privately, despite the protests of the German officers who were trying to prevent any outside contact with their victim. I was able to turn over my documentation to the Danish inspector and provide him with detailed testimony about the murders and labor abuses that were taking place aboard the Aida Prima. However, the investigation that followed was limited by jurisdictional complications and Aida's corporate legal resources, which were used to challenge every aspect of the evidence and discredit my testimony as the fabrications of a disgruntled employee who was seeking financial compensation for imaginary grievances. Several key witnesses among the Filipino crew members were transferred to other ships before they could be interviewed, and physical evidence from the ship was destroyed or contaminated during the investigation process. The criminal charges that were eventually filed resulted in minimal penalties for Aida and short prison sentences for a few low-level officers who were portrayed as rogue individuals rather than participants in a systematic criminal operation that had been sanctioned by corporate management. The families of the murdered crew members never learned the truth about what had happened to their loved ones, and most of the Filipino workers who survived their contracts were too afraid or too powerless to pursue legal action against the cruise line. The Aida Prima continued operating with new crew members who were subjected to the same abusive conditions, and the systems that had enabled the murders and exploitation remained in place despite the investigation and prosecution of some of the perpetrators. The experience of working on that cruise ship and witnessing the systematic murder of my fellow Filipino workers taught me that the cruise industry operates with levels of criminality and disregard for human life that most passengers never imagine when they book their vacations on these floating death traps. The people who clean their cabins, serve their food, and maintain their ships are often trapped in conditions that amount to slavery. And when they try to speak out about the abuse they suffer, they face retaliation that can include murder and disposal of their bodies in ways that ensure their families will never learn what happened to them. The fact that major cruise lines can commit these crimes with virtual impunity, protected by corporate legal resources and the complexities of maritime law, makes me wonder how many other Filipino workers have disappeared from cruise ships without ever being reported as missing or investigated as potential murder victims. My name is Diego, and I was the cruise director aboard the Costa Fascinosa during what would become known as the worst passenger crisis in the cruise line's history. Though the full truth of what happened during our final night in the Eastern Mediterranean has never been officially acknowledged by Costa Cruises or any maritime authority, I had been working in the cruise industry for 15 years, developing entertainment programs and managing passenger activities for thousands of guests who trusted me to provide them with safe, enjoyable experiences during their vacations at sea. What began as a routine 7-day Mediterranean cruise in September 2020 became a nightmare of human savagery and corporate negligence that demonstrated just how quickly civilization can collapse when people are trapped in a confined space with limited resources and no hope of immediate rescue. The events I witnessed during those final 18 hours changed everything I believed about human nature and convinced me that cruise ships are floating disasters waiting to happen when the systems that maintain order and safety inevitably fail. The Costa Fascinosa was carrying 2,600 passengers and 800 crew members when we departed from Barcelona on what was scheduled to be a leisurely voyage through the Mediterranean, with planned stops in Palma de Mallorca, Rome, Florence, and Monaco before returning to Spain. The passenger manifest included families with young children, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, and groups of friends looking forward to a week of relaxation and entertainment in some of Europe's most beautiful coastal destinations. As cruise director, I was responsible for coordinating all onboard activities, managing the entertainment staff, and ensuring that passengers remained engaged and satisfied throughout their vacation experience. The first 6 days of the cruise proceeded exactly as planned, with successful shore excursions, well-attended shows and activities, and the kind of positive passenger feedback that made my job rewarding and fulfilling. The crisis began on our final full day at sea, when we were approximately 100 miles south of Monaco and scheduled to arrive at our home port the following morning. At around 11 p.m., the ship suffered what was initially reported as a minor electrical malfunction that caused temporary power outages in some sections of the vessel. However, within 30 minutes, it became clear that we were dealing with a complete systems failure that affected not only the electrical grid, but also the propulsion systems, navigation equipment, water treatment facilities, and communication arrays that connected us to the outside world. The captain's initial announcement assured passengers that the technical problems were temporary and that backup systems would restore normal operations within a few hours. But I could tell from the tone of his voice and the activity I observed among the crew that the situation was far more serious than anyone was willing to admit publicly. By midnight, the ship was dead in the water with no propulsion, no air conditioning, no refrigeration for food storage, and no means of communicating with Coast Guard authorities or rescue vessels that could provide assistance. The backup generators that should have maintained essential systems had also failed, leaving us completely dependent on battery-powered emergency lighting that would only last for a few hours. More critically, the water purification and waste management systems had shut down completely, meaning that we had no access to fresh drinking water and no means of disposing of human waste for over 3,000 people who were now trapped on a floating prison in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. The realization that we were facing a survival situation rather than a temporary inconvenience began to spread among the passengers, and I could feel the mood aboard the ship changing from mild concern to genuine fear and desperation. The first signs of social breakdown appeared around 3 a.m., when passengers began demanding answers and solutions that neither I nor the ship's officers were able to provide. Groups of passengers had gathered in the main lounges and dining areas, and their conversations were becoming increasingly agitated as they realized that the ship's staff had no immediate plans for resolving the crisis or evacuating the vessel. Some passengers had access to satellite phones or emergency communication devices that allowed them to contact family members on shore. And word began to spread that the ship was not responding to radio calls from maritime authorities who were trying to coordinate rescue operations. The knowledge that we were effectively cut off from outside help, combined with the rising temperatures in the unventilated interior spaces and the growing concern about depleting food and water supplies, created an atmosphere of panic that I had never experienced during my years working on cruise ships. The situation deteriorated rapidly as the hours passed, and it became clear that rescue was not imminent, and that the ship's emergency supplies were completely inadequate for sustaining 3,000 people for an extended period without external support. By dawn on what should have been our final day, passengers had begun organizing themselves into groups based on nationality, age, and physical capability, with stronger individuals beginning to assert control over weaker passengers who were seen as competitors for the limited resources available on the ship. I watched as civilized, educated people who had been enjoying cocktails and entertainment just hours earlier began hoarding food and water, forming alliances based on mutual protection, and discussing strategies for securing access to the lifeboats and emergency equipment that might provide their only means of survival if the ship could not be rescued quickly. The violence began around noon on that second day, when a fight broke out in the main dining hall over access to the remaining food supplies that the kitchen staff had been trying to distribute fairly among the passengers. What started as an argument between two families escalated into a brawl involving dozens of people, and I realized that normal social conventions had completely broken down as fear and desperation took control of people's behavior. Several passengers were seriously injured during this initial confrontation, But with the ship's medical facilities operating on battery power and limited supplies, there was little that could be done to treat wounds or prevent infections that could become life-threatening in the unsanitary conditions that were developing throughout the vessel. As the day progressed, the passenger population fragmented into competing factions that began claiming territory within different sections of the ship and establishing their own rules for distributing resources and maintaining order within their controlled areas. The largest and most organized group was led by a German businessman who had convinced about 400 passengers to follow his leadership in exchange for promised protection and priority access to food and water supplies. This group had taken control of the upper deck areas and had begun barricading the entrances to prevent other passengers from accessing the outdoor spaces where the air was still breathable and where emergency equipment was stored. A second faction, composed mainly of younger passengers and crew members, had secured the lower deck areas, including the engine rooms and storage facilities, giving them control over the ship's remaining supplies, but trapping them in areas where the heat and toxic fumes from the failed systems made survival increasingly difficult. The most disturbing development was the emergence of what could only be described as vigilante justice, as different passenger groups began identifying individuals who they blamed for the crisis or who they viewed as threats to their survival. Several crew members who had been trying to maintain order and distribute resources fairly were attacked and beaten by passengers who accused them of hoarding supplies or planning to abandon the ship without evacuating everyone. I witnessed elderly passengers being physically assaulted and robbed of their medications and personal belongings by groups of younger travelers who had decided that survival of the fittest was the only viable strategy for dealing with the crisis. Women traveling alone were particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation, as some male passengers seemed to view the breakdown of normal authority structures as an opportunity to act on their worst impulses without fear of consequences. By the evening of the second day, the ship had essentially become a collection of armed camps, with different groups controlling access to various resources and facilities through the threat or use of violence against anyone who challenged their authority. The ship's officers had lost all effective control over the situation and had retreated to the bridge where they were attempting to restore communication systems and coordinate with potential rescue operations. But their efforts were hampered by the hostile passenger groups who viewed the crew as either incompetent or as potential competitors for the limited space available on lifeboats if evacuation became necessary. I found myself moving between different passenger groups, trying to negotiate temporary truces and prevent the most serious acts of violence. But it was clear that my authority as cruise director had become meaningless in a situation where physical strength and willingness to use violence were the only currencies that mattered. The final breakdown of civilization occurred during the third night, when rumors spread that rescue ships were approaching and that only a limited number of passengers would be evacuated during the initial rescue operation. The prospect of potential salvation combined with the fear of being left behind triggered a complete collapse of the fragile alliances that had been maintaining some semblance of order among the passenger groups. Fighting broke out simultaneously in multiple areas of the ship as different factions attempted to secure control of the lifeboat stations and upper deck areas, where rescue helicopters would be most likely to attempt evacuations. I watched as passengers who had been cooperating for survival just hours earlier turned on each other with a savagery that seemed impossible among people who had been enjoying a luxury cruise just days before. The violence that erupted during those final hours was beyond anything I could have imagined, with passengers using makeshift weapons fashioned from ship equipment to attack anyone they perceived as standing between them and survival. Several people were killed during the fighting, including an elderly man who was thrown overboard by a group of passengers who wanted to reduce competition for limited lifeboat space, and a young woman who was beaten to death when she tried to protect her children from adults who were attempting to claim their spots in what was believed to be an imminent evacuation. The ship's medical facilities were overwhelmed with injured passengers. But the medical staff were unable to provide adequate treatment due to the breakdown of basic sanitation and the lack of supplies needed to treat serious wounds and prevent infections. The rescue operation that finally reached us on the fourth day found a ship that bore no resemblance to the luxury cruise vessel that had departed from Barcelona less than a week earlier. The passengers who were evacuated were traumatized, malnourished, and in many cases seriously injured from the violence that had consumed the ship during the previous 72 hours. Several dozen people were unaccounted for and presumed to have been killed during the fighting or to have died from injuries and medical conditions that could not be treated in the chaotic conditions aboard the ship. The official investigation into the incident focused primarily on the technical failures that had disabled the ship's systems, with minimal attention given to the social breakdown and violence that had occurred among the passengers during the crisis. The cruise line's response to the disaster was to emphasize the technical nature of the system's failures while downplaying the human element of what had occurred during the emergency. Passengers who survived the ordeal were offered financial settlements in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing the violence and social breakdown they had witnessed. And the media coverage of the incident focused on the heroic rescue operation rather than the disturbing behavior that had been displayed by ordinary people when faced with a survival situation. The families of passengers who had been killed during the violence were told that their loved ones had died from medical emergencies or accidents related to the ship's technical failures, with no acknowledgement that they had actually been murdered by fellow passengers who had reverted to primitive survival instincts when civilized society had collapsed around them. The experience of witnessing the complete breakdown of human civilization during those 4 days changed my entire perspective on cruise travel and human nature, convincing me that the thin veneer of politeness and cooperation that characterizes normal cruise ship life can disappear within hours when people are faced with genuine threats to their survival. The fact that educated, affluent passengers could transform into violent savages so quickly demonstrated that cruise ships are fundamentally dangerous environments where thousands of people are trapped together with no means of escape if emergency situations overwhelm the systems and authority structures that maintain order and safety. I never returned to work in the cruise industry after that experience, but I often think about the passengers and crew members who died during those 4 days. And I wonder how many other cruise ship disasters have involved similar breakdowns of human decency that were covered up or ignored by companies more concerned with protecting their reputations than acknowledging the true dangers of cruise travel. The Verified Fears family, I hope these 11 disturbing testimonies have opened your eyes to the dark realities that exist beneath the glossy surface of the cruise industry. If you found these stories as chilling as I did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more terrifying true accounts that will keep you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world around you. And if you have your own cruise ship horror story or any other terrifying experience you'd like to share, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones wearing uniforms and smiling while they serve you dinner.